Okay, good morning. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, people who are simply curious, you are all welcome here at TL Atheist Church. We call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. So today we have a talk called Why We No Longer Believe in Witches, or question mark, why do we no longer believe in witches?
All right, here's why atheism is a bad thing. This is a very concise argument. The reason atheism is a bad thing is, first, belief in God is a cultural universal. Second, if you believe in adaptivism, then you believe that any long-standing cultural practice must have adaptive value, otherwise it wouldn't be around. And so, therefore, you can conclude that belief in the gods must be adaptive, right? So we should all give up on this whole atheism thing, go off, there's a church over there. Okay. No, wait, sit. So let me go through that argument slightly more slowly. So first premise again is that belief in gods, religion, is a cultural universal. And if you look at the stats, it's pretty clear. Right now there are 2.1 billion Christians on earth. That's 33% of the religious pie out there. 33% of people on earth are Christian. Islam, 1.5 billion, 21%. And then finally, this kind of surprised me, there are atheists out there. There's 1.1 billion atheists, and that's 16% of the total population on Earth. So that's actually, more than I thought. But I'll just in terms of the general premise, there's billions and billions of people who are Christian or Islamic. So, I'll give it to them that religion, or at least a belief in the gods, is a cultural universal. So I think that premise is justified. The second premise is that any long-standing cultural practice must be adaptive, or otherwise it wouldn't be around, right? If people have done something for a long period of time, then it must have some adaptive value within the culture where they're, doing this practice. Edgerton writes, there is a pervasive assumption among anthropologists that a population's long-standing beliefs and practices, their culture and their social institutions must play a positive role in their lives, or these beliefs and practices would not have persisted. Thus, it is widely thought and written that cannibalism, torture, infanticide, feuding, witchcraft, painful male initiations, female genital mutilation, ceremonial rape, headhunting, and other practices that must be abhorrent to many of us must serve some useful function in the societies in which they are traditional practices. Impressed by the wisdom of biological evolution in creating such adaptive miracles as feathers for flight or protective coloration, most scholars have assumed that cultural evolution too has been guided by a process of natural selection that has produced traditional beliefs and practices that meet people's needs. So again, this is a position in anthropology called functionalism and adaptivism. And the idea is if it's a cultural practice, if it's long-standing, it must be useful. There must be some reason why people have that cultural practice. And then finally, the conclusion from these two premises is religion must be adaptive, right? Otherwise, why would billions of people do it? And historically, why do so many people believe in the gods? All right, so the purpose of this sermon today is I want to examine that argument, and I'm going to examine this argument by, I'm going to take advantage of some research that Robert Edgerton did in a book called Six Societies. And to give you some context on this book, so how many of you have seen Dances with Wolves? Kevin Costner. Okay, so he's out there. It's a great movie, came out in the 1990s. So you can interpret this entire book by Edgerton as a rebuttal against Dances with Wolves. And his goal in the book is really to show that many practices that actually, that for folk societies, many of the practices they have are, incredibly suboptimal. And he's really trying to do an extended argument against the idea that any long-standing cultural practice must be adaptive in some manner. So let me give you some examples from the book. These are my favorite examples. Let me start with his example of Duddy's Branch. Duddy's Branch is great. So Duddy's Branch was a group of people in Kentucky, in eastern Kentucky. It's 238 people. And if you just want to imagine the worst possible way to live, just imagine living in Duddy's Branch. That's the worst possible way to live. Let me just describe life in Duddy's Branch. The inhabitants of this remote mountain valley lived in ramshackle wood and tar paper shacks along a 1-mile stretch of polluted stream. Their houses had no indoor toilets, and only a few had functional privies. Most people simply defecated on the ground, leaving their feces to be eaten by their emaciated dogs or to be carried into the river by the frequent rains. In addition to human feces, the stream was polluted by all manner of garbage and waste that people threw into it. Nevertheless, it provided the people's only source of water. Okay, so that sounds pretty disgusting. Don't really want to live there. But it gets worse. Not only was the place filthy and unsanitary, the children were massively undereducated. Not only could these unschooled children not perform rudimentary tasks of reasoning when asked to do so, they were unable to draw a circle or a square, raise their right or left arms, extend their fingers, or spell their names. Gazaway, he's the guy who was researching the community, wrote, "I showed them a series of pictures pasted on cardboard. Cat, raccoon, rabbit, otter, rat, squirrel. What are they? I inquired. Reckon they're cats, they responded." So if it wasn't so sad, it would be a little funny, right? But this is the strange thing about this story about Duddy's Branch. The people in the community were fiercely loyal to it. They were given, for example, some of the anthropologists who studied this community, they took some of the people from the community out to the bigger city so that they can, be educated in the larger school system, and they went back. They went back to, this was in Kentucky, right? I mean, they could have moved to a different area of Kentucky. They had, possibilities in front of them, but they felt fierce loyalty to the community. The author writes, "Here then is, or at least was, a physically unwell population that could not feed itself, that had no apparent social institutions they valued, whose children would seemingly qualify as being mentally retarded, and who were apparently incapable of doing anything to improve their nutrition, health, comfort, or general well-being." That this was only part of the reality of Duddy's Branch. Despite the absence of any kind of ritual, ceremony, or community-wide activities, these people were fiercely loyal to their hollow and their way of life. In other words, they weren't willing to give up on it. They were super, super loyal to their community. Okay, so let me talk about a different group, another group that he discusses in the book. This is the Tasmanians. And Tasmanians are super interesting. Tasmania is an island off of Australia, but what makes it special is Tasmania was completely isolated from the Australian mainland. And so there was no contact between Tasmania, the people who lived there, and the rest of humanity for more than 10,000 years. So the first contact was when European settlers came, and they, around 1801. And when the European settlers came, an anthropologist came very soon after. Actually, Francis Perot, who's considered the world's first anthropologist, he was the first person ever to be called an anthropologist. He came in 1801 to study the Tasmanians, who were completely isolated from the rest of the world. There were about 4,000 people in Tasmania when Perot came and visited the island. So there's a lot of strange things about the Tasmanians, but one of the biggest things the strangest things about the Tasmanians is they forgot a lot of technology that they had on the Australian mainland. So he noticed immediately was they had forgot how to create wooden boomerangs, barbed spears, edge-ground axes. But the biggest thing that they forgot how to do, probably the most important thing for their life, is they no longer fished. And the reason that this was important is winters they were pretty bad in Tasmania. It was hard to get food, and fishing would have been a smart thing to do. By the time the Europeans arrived, the Tasmanians had no fish hooks, fish spears, or nets. And when they were offered cooked fish by European visitors, they rejected it with revulsion. For a population that spent most of its time seeking food, ate virtually every other food source on the island, and were desperately hungry during winter months, to reject fish as a source of food borders on the bizarre. So, but that's not the strangest thing. The Tasmanians also forgot how to create fire, which would also be useful during those winter months. So they had to keep the different bands of Tasmanians had to keep a firebrand with them to be able to warm themselves, start their cooking when they moved from place to place. But they didn't have the ability to create a new fire themselves. They had to rely on carrying fire with them as they moved around the island. And then finally, they never really created clothing. Again, cold place. It's a cold place here. Despite the bitterly cold winters the Tasmanians had to endure, they apparently made no effort to fashion clothing. They simply threw a kangaroo skin over their shoulders or smeared themselves with animal fat. So very, very cold winters. So Tasmanian tribes also weren't particularly peaceful. They tended to fight one another all the time, but the fights weren't over resources. There were enough, the resources were evenly enough distributed across Tasmania that they could have just divided up the land and everyone would have been happy. What the fights were really over were women. They were raiding other tribes. And that brings up another problem with Tasmanian culture. Tasmanian culture was badly unequal. Let me explain what it would be like to be a woman in Tasmania. If you're a Tasmanian woman, you fetched water and firewood and gathered vegetable products. They alone collected shellfish, the dietary staple, by diving deep into coastal waters where sharp rocks, unpredictable currents, and stingrays were dangerous hazards. More remarkable still, the job of climbing eucalyptus trees to a height of as much as 90 feet to club possums to death also fell to women, and it was women who swam and crept up on sleeping sills to club them to death. So the women were responsible really for gathering all the food. They gathered all the food, they hunted all the animals, everything that they depended on to live on. It was women out there, foraging and bringing back and doing all the dangerous jobs. Tasmanian men, on the other hand, spent most of their time relaxing and talking, and they liked to hunt for kangaroos, but not because it had so much nutritional value. It was incredibly entertaining, apparently, to hunt for kangaroos. So they're off, relaxing and hunting for kangaroos all day. When the Europeans made contact with the Tasmanians, they introduced them to dogs for the first time because they didn't have dogs in Tasmania. And the men were super excited over dogs because it helped them hunt, right? To have dogs all of a sudden. So they immediately traded all of their young women for dogs. And then the Tasmanian society collapsed. That was it for Tasmania. So, anyway, bad choice. Okay, one more society from the book. This is the society called the Xhosa people. They lived in Southeast Africa. And, again, not a good thing to be a Xhosa person. You wouldn't want to be part of the Xhosa tribe. They had just lost a war with the British. They had, the British were invading that area of Africa, and they lost a lot of their population in that war. And also, their cattle were infected with this lung disease brought in by settlers. So they were having a hard time of it. And for the Xhosa, cattle were extremely important. It was their basis for, all their food supplies. The men would sing to their cows every day. Their cows were super, super important. But anyway, so things were going badly. And this was in 1856 when this happened. But a teenage girl went into the woods, and she was told by 3 spirits that the Xhosa should kill all of their cattle and destroy all of their crops. And this was the only way to stop the witchcraft. So they were convinced that the reason that some of their cattle were dying was because of witchcraft, right? That there had to be a reason, and the reason must have been because of witchcraft. And then this teenager went into the forest, and she came back, and she told her uncle that she was told by these spirits that, well, they have to kill all of the cattle. And not only kill all the cattle, but all of their crops, too. They need to destroy all of their crops to be able to appease the spirits. And she wrote, she didn't write, she told her uncle, the spirits commanded that not an animal of all their herds was to remain alive, and every grain of corn was to be destroyed. If that were done on a given date, myriads of cattle more beautiful than those destroyed would issue from the earth, while great fields of corn ripe and ready for harvest would instantly appear. The dead would rise, trouble and sickness vanish, and youth and beauty come to all alike. unbelievers and the hated white man would on that day perish. So that's what she told everyone. She told everyone that. And can you imagine what the Hosa chief, King Sarhili, did? He immediately said, okay, we better do that. And so what they did, they listened to a teenage girl who came back from the woods and told them to kill all their cattle and all their crops. And he turned around and demanded that all of his people slaughter all their cattle and all their crops. Now, not everyone did it, but a lot of people, including the king, by the way, killed all of his cattle.
Well, that's clearly why it didn't work.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah. So then so soon many Hosa had killed all their cattle. While the cattle were being slaughtered, the Hosa sang, drank beer, and danced as they gorged themselves on beef. There was so much of it that it was impossible to eat more than a small portion of it. The rest was left to rot. And going back to what you said, so the day of the prophecy came, and of course nothing happened, right? There was nothing happened at all. But the argument that she made, of course, was, well, not everyone killed all their cattle, so that's why it didn't come to pass. And but now here's the sad part. In 1855, before the starvation began, there was approximately 105,000 Hosa in King Sarhili's domain. By 1858, there was only 25,916. So somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people died just because of a teenage girl coming back from the woods, telling people a prophecy from spirits. It's not easy to laugh now when you consider that's a lot of people who died on one person's word, right, from a superstitious source. Okay, so those are the three main stories. Now, just so you don't think that this is some funny thing that, folk people do, that folk people have maladaptive beliefs and they do crazy stuff. Remember, we have a lot of maladaptive beliefs and practices in our society as well. It doesn't take long to bring them up. War, smoking, McDonald's. All these things are extremely maladaptive, but they're long-standing practices. One of the maladaptive beliefs that was around for a very long time in our society, in early American society, was dueling, right? Dueling for honor. And just to give you a list of some of the people who were involved in dueling, includes Lincoln, Voltaire, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Napoleon. And of course, we lost the guy on our $10 bill over a duel, right? That was the duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was killed off in a duel that he didn't even really want to participate in, but he said he felt like he had to do it anyway because of his honor. And then, of course, there's superstition, which has been a part of all of these different societies. And there's a good example that Edgerton gives about superstition in his book, how superstition can be extremely maladaptive. So the Inuits, they live in a very cold climate, right? In fact, they had to develop some really advanced technology to be able to live in that climate. Like our modern goggles are based on the technology. They had to learn how to, survive a very freezing climate. But they were also extremely superstitious, and they had a very odd superstition. Their superstition all had to do with wild babies. So they were worried that there were wild babies roaming the cold, land, and at night they would devour people like wolves, or this is worse, or they would tickle people to death. Oh. So you had to be careful, or you'd be tickled to death by a wild baby while you're outside. So this really did have an effect on how much food they could gather, because there's certain areas that they could go to fish or to raise crops, because that's where the wild babies are. So that's a superstition again that had a maladaptive consequence. And some cultural practices is not so much that they're bad for everyone in a culture, they're bad for a certain subgroup in a culture. So some practices are, it's based off of the fact that, some people are getting ahead over others. A good example of that is, cannibalism. Great for the cannibal, not so great for the cannibalized. And I was shocked actually while reading this stuff how much cannibalism was part of our past. I didn't realize, for example, that the Aztecs, they sacrificed over 250,000 people a year in their Aztec temples, and 250,000 a year, and that was mainly for protein, right? They would grab people from the surrounding tribes. They would come in, have the religious ceremony, and it was 250,000. I can't get that number on my head. That's a huge number of people. Cannibalism was also part of the traditions of American Indians. The Indians who lived in Texas practiced cannibalism. There's a lot of different areas, very common. And apparently cannibalism has been part of our history since the common ancestors of both humans and Neanderthals, 800,000 years ago. They found traces of human blood in ancient excrement and cooking pots, and they also found human bite marks on human bones. Zombie cannibals. That's right. So anyway, so not a good practice, right? Cannibalism, bad. Been around forever. The other practice, of course, that was long-standing is slavery, right? I mean, slavery's been around for millennia. In 1860, right before the American Civil War, slaves were 13% of the entire population and 33% of the population of the South. So huge group of people. Slavery is great if you're a plantation owner, not so great if you're a slave, right? So another long-standing practice that may, arguably would be maladaptive for at least a large segment of the population. Okay, so the argument here is that the reason I'm bringing up these examples is to demonstrate, it's really, again, this is an argument against dances with wolves, right? That there's something that if you are in a folk society, or if you're in any culture that has these long-standing practices, that they must be somehow good for the people to do them, or otherwise they wouldn't do them. Edgerton writes, traditional solutions and long-standing beliefs and practices tend to persist, not because they are optimally beneficial, but because they generally work just well enough that changes in them are not self-evidently needed. And one of the interesting things that you get, not only from the Edgerton book, but also from Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, is it doesn't really take that much for a traditional belief just to vanish and for people to change their practices. There's a lot of examples of that. For example, duels. I talked about Alexander Hamilton dying in a duel. Duels didn't disappear until they were ridiculed. That's what stopped honor dueling, until people started making fun of people who dueled. Pinker writes, the career of dueling showcases a puzzling phenomenon we will often encounter. A category of violence can be embedded in a civilization for centuries and then vanish into thin air. Historians have noted that the institution was buried not so much by legal bans or moral disapproval as by ridicule. When, quote, solemn gentlemen went to the field of honor only to be laughed at by the younger generation, that was more than any custom, no matter how sanctified by tradition, could endure. In wars, according to Pinker, one of the reasons that the number of people who have died in wars has gone down so much was because arbitrary boundaries were created by the UN around countries, and those boundaries were respected. And the idea is that among respectable countries now, conquest is no longer a thinkable option. A politician in democracy today who suggested conquering another country would be met not with counter-arguments, but with puzzlement, embarrassment, or laughter. I mean, maybe Trump might recommend going into raiding Canada, I don't know. But in general, it's not something that a respectable politician would suggest as an option in a democracy anymore. And of course, cannibalism was stopped after pressure from Christian missionaries. It just, completely went away. Very quickly, for example, in Fiji, cannibalism was very, very common. Again, Christian missionaries came in, and it stopped almost immediately. And now it's safe to go on a vacation in Fiji, so that's a good thing. But the final example I want to talk about, because yesterday was Halloween, and this is supposedly a sermon on witchcraft, is I did want to say a little bit about witchcraft, because it's interesting to me because there's so much overlap between witchcraft and religion. They're really sisters, right? They're both the belief in the supernatural. And it's interesting that I know there are Wiccans out there. I know there are, I think according to the stats I looked at, there's a few 100,000 Wiccans, but they're no longer, if you talk to your neighbor, it'd be very unlikely that you would come across someone who's, actively practicing witchcraft, at least in the sense that they're talking about, and people don't worry about witchcraft all the time like people were obsessed with in the past. So I wanted to talk a little bit about witchcraft, what happened in witchcraft. And so witchcraft, it's very common among, especially folk societies. According to Pinker, witchcraft is one of the most common motives for revenge among hunter-gatherer and tribal societies. In their theory of causation, there's no such thing as a natural death. Any fatality that cannot be explained by an observable cause is explained by an unobservable one, namely sorcery. Right? This is Steven Pinker talking about folk societies. So in Europe, the craze around witchcraft started in the 15th century when two monks published a book. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Latin name for it, the Malleus Oh, nice, impressive. Malleus Maleficarum? Carm? Maleficarum. I have to practice, yeah.
It's like the evil hammer or what?
Yeah.
Witches.
Yeah.
Witches.
Yeah. The hammer of the witches. One of the interesting things about this book is it spread very quickly because it was published 30 years after the printing press. So it's interesting, technology actually allowed superstition to spread very quickly across Europe. This book, over the next 2 centuries, it indirectly influenced French and German witch hunters. And the French and German witch hunters are estimated to have killed somewhere between 60 and 100,000 witches. It's a lot of people, mostly women. Most died horrible deaths. You weren't only burned at the stake, that's pretty bad all by itself, but you were usually tortured nonstop to confess all the evil witch things that you did before you were burned on the stake. So witchcraft, really, really horrible belief, ended up in hundreds of thousands of innocent people dying. That's a horrible thing. So what stopped witchcraft? Why did people stop believing in witchcraft? Well, Pinker cites this one event. And so let me explain what the one event was. The Duke of Brunswick in Germany was so shocked by the methods used by inquisitors in his duchy, they asked 2 famous Jesuit scholars to supervise the hearings. After a careful study, the Jesuits told the Duke, the inquisitors are doing their duty. They are arresting only people who have been implicated by the confession of other witches. Come with me to the torture chamber, suggested the Duke. The priests followed him to where a wretched woman was being stretched on the rack. Let me question her, suggested the Duke. Now, woman, you are a confessed witch. I suspect these 2 men of being warlocks. What do you say? Another turn of the rack, executioners? No, screamed the woman. You are quite right. I have often seen them at the Sabbath. They can turn themselves into goats, wolves, and other animals. What else do you know about them? Demanded the Duke. Several witches have had children by them. One woman even had 8 children, whom these men fathered. The children have heads like toads and legs like spiders. The Duke turned to the astonished Jesuits. Shall I put you to the torture until you confess, my friends? Anyway, so it's a great story. But apparently, this is what Pinker claims. One of the priests were so impressed by this demonstration, they wrote a book in 1631, which has been widely credited with ending the belief in witchcraft across Europe. 1749 was the last year that any witch was burned anywhere in Europe. Just for comparison, Salem witch trials were happening around 1692, and we're talking around 20 people dying in the Salem witch trial. So the interesting thing to me, there's a couple of things that are interesting about that story, but Pinker really gives 2 explanations for the ending of witchcraft. He attributed it to 2 reasons. First is the realization that some events, even those with profound personal significance, must be attributed to impersonal physical forces and raw chance rather than the designs of other conscious beings. A great principle of moral advancement, on a par with love thy neighbor and all men are created equal, is the one on the bumper sticker, shit happens. So it's what he's saying here is, remember, according to Pinker, the reason people came up with the theory of sorcery and witchcraft was to explain, why certain events happened that they didn't have any other explanation for. It's the theory of causation if you don't have a science. But if you can just believe that sometimes random shit happens, then that puts you in a position where you don't have to blame someone when something horrible happens, when you get some weird disease or your hair falls out or whatever. You don't have to blame a witch anymore. You can just say, well, it's a random horrible event. The other reason that Pinker gives is, and this is a general theme of his book, is that people start giving more value to human life and happiness, and so they're less likely to immediately move to violence, and burn people at the stake when they suspected them of doing something wrong. And of course, religion is very similar to witchcraft, right? They're both a belief in the supernatural. My hope is that the religious beliefs around, supernatural beings like the gods and so on will die out as quickly as belief in witchcraft died out. And one of the interesting things is what both Pinker and Edgar can argue, which are some of these practices who have lasted for hundreds and in some cases, thousands of years. In some cases, they just disappeared within a few years. I mean, when people change their understanding of the world or change their beliefs. And so, as Pinker points out, our culture has continuously progressed over time. The amount of violence has gone down. Our belief in superstition has gone down. We have gone through a process of adaptation. It's just that it's not perfect, right? We have maladaptive belief. You don't have pressure to be able to replace those beliefs. They tend to stay around. But the good news is, as both Pinker and the Beatles say, things are getting better all the time. So let's discuss.